In November 1962, a state health inspector named Robert Kellerman made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Deep in the Ozark mountains of Arkansas, while investigating reports of a disturbed household in the remote Blackwater Valley, he found a child locked in a root cellar beneath the Grimwald family homestead. The boy, estimated to be 12 years old, had 4 arms and 4 legs, not separate limbs, but grotesquely fused appendages that twisted from his torso like the branches of a diseased tree. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. According to Kellerman's classified report, filed 3 days later and buried in state archives for 60 years, the child wasn't alone. There were others. And the medical records that emerged painted a picture so horrific that Arkansas officials sealed the files and ordered the entire investigation destroyed. Before we dive into this forbidden medical nightmare, subscribe and share your thoughts below. It's viewers like you who help preserve these buried truths from being lost forever. Robert Kellerman had been investigating rural health violations across Arkansas for nearly 15 years when he received the anonymous letter in October 1962. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but the message was clear. Children were being kept in conditions unfit for animals in the Blackwater Valley. The letter was unsigned, postmarked from the tiny settlement of Grimwald Hollow, population 43. Kellerman had seen his share of rural poverty and neglect, but something about the letter unsettled him. Perhaps it was the way the writer described the children as malformed by God's judgment, or the plea to save them before winter comes. Whatever the reason, he drove the winding mountain roads to Blackwater Valley on a grey November morning that would change everything. The Grimwald homestead sat at the end of a dirt road that seemed to disappear into the forest itself. Built sometime in the 1890s, the house was a rambling structure of rotting wood and rusted tin, surrounded by outbuildings that looked ready to collapse. But it was the silence that struck Kellerman first. No dogs barking, no chickens scratching in the yard. No signs of normal life. When he knocked on the front door, it was answered by a woman who introduced herself as Constance Grimwald, though she appeared far too young to be the matriarch of such an obviously old family line. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, and they never quite met his gaze. Behind her, in the shadows of the house, Kellerman could see movement. Shapes that seemed too small to be adults, too quiet to be normal children. State Health Department, Kellerman announced, showing his credentials. We've received reports about conditions here that require investigation. Constance Grimwald's face remained expressionless. Ain't nothing here needs investigating, mister. We keep to ourselves, don't cause no trouble for nobody. But as they spoke, Kellerman heard something that made his blood run cold. A sound like an animal in distress, coming from somewhere beneath the house. When he asked about it, Constance claimed it was just the wind through the root cellar. She was lying, and they both knew it. Kellerman's initial inspection of the house revealed conditions that were deplorable, but not unprecedented in the remote Ozarks. The family appeared to consist of Constance, her husband Tobias, a gaunt man in his 60s, who spoke in barely audible whispers, and what they claimed were their 6 children, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers. But something was wrong with the numbers. Kellerman counted at least 9 children during his walkthrough, and their ages seemed impossible given Constance's apparent youth. More disturbing were the children themselves. While none appeared severely malnourished, they all bore subtle signs of what Kellerman initially assumed was inbreeding. Unusually long limbs, eyes that didn't quite align, movements that seemed somehow unnatural. But it was their behavior that truly unsettled him. They moved in perfect synchronization, never speaking unless spoken to, and their eyes held an awareness that seemed far too ancient for their apparent ages. When Kellerman insisted on inspecting the root cellar, Tobias Grimwald finally spoke up. "That's just storage down there. Ain't fit for visiting folks." But the sounds from below had grown louder, no longer just distressed whimpering, but what sounded like multiple voices calling out in a language Kellerman didn't recognize. When he threatened to return with law enforcement, Constance and Tobias exchanged a look that seemed to carry the weight of terrible secrets. "Show him," Constance said finally. "Maybe it's time." The cellar stairs were narrow and treacherous, carved directly into the earth and reinforced with rotting timber. As Kellerman descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew thick with a smell he would later describe as medical waste mixed with something ancient and wrong. What he found in the cellar would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the dim light of a single kerosene lantern, Kellerman discovered what appeared to be a medical facility carved into the earth beneath the Grimwald house. Rough wooden tables held instruments that looked like surgical tools, and the walls were lined with jars containing organic specimens preserved in cloudy fluid. But it was the children that made him vomit into the corner of the cellar. There were 4 of them, ranging in apparent age from 8 to 15, and each was a grotesque testament to what Kellerman would later learn was decades of systematic medical experimentation. The boy who had first caught his attention, the one with 4 arms and 4 legs, was chained to a table near the back of the cellar. But he wasn't alone. A girl, perhaps 10 years old, appeared to have been surgically merged with what looked like animal parts. Her left arm ended in what appeared to be a cow's hoof, while her right leg bent at impossible angles, suggesting bones that had been broken and allowed to heal incorrectly. She watched Kellerman with eyes that held no hope, only a terrible patience. Another child, gender impossible to determine, seemed to have multiple spinal columns running parallel down their back, creating a writhing, serpentine movement that defied human anatomy. When they tried to speak, the sound emerged from multiple points along their throat, creating a harmony of voices that spoke in unison. But the 4th child was perhaps the most disturbing of all. At first glance, they appeared normal, a boy of perhaps 12 with sandy hair and freckles. But as Kellerman watched in horror, the child's face began to shift and change, cycling through what appeared to be the features of multiple different people, as if several faces had been somehow layered beneath the skin. "They're my experiments," Constance Grimwald said from behind him. Kellerman spun around to find her standing at the bottom of the stairs, no longer the simple mountain woman she had pretended to be. 40 years of careful work, bringing together what God kept separate. According to the documents Kellerman found in a filing cabinet hidden behind a false wall, the medical experiments in the Grimwald cellar had been ongoing since 1923. The files contained detailed surgical notes, anatomical sketches, and photographs that defied belief. Images of children in various stages of what could only be described as deliberate mutation. The records revealed that Constance Grimwald was not the young woman she appeared to be, but rather the daughter of Dr. Mordecai Grimwald, a physician who had been expelled from Johns Hopkins Medical College in 1919 for conducting unauthorized human experiments. Fleeing to the remote Ozarks, he had established his practice in Blackwater Valley, where the isolation and poverty of the mountain communities provided him with both privacy and an endless supply of subjects. Dr. Grimwald's notes, written in a precise medical hand, detailed his obsession with what he called structural recombination, the surgical fusion of human limbs and organs to create what he believed would be a superior form of human being. His early experiments had been crude, resulting in subjects who died within days or weeks. But over the decades, he had refined his techniques, learning to keep his creations alive for years at a time. The most chilling aspect of the records was their clinical detachment. Children were referred to only by numbers and described in terms of their modifications. Subject 47, successful integration of secondary arm structure, minimal rejection response. Subject 52, spinal multiplication proceeding as planned, motor function improving. But even more disturbing was the source of his subjects. The records showed that Dr. Grimwald had been purchasing children from desperate mountain families for decades, paying between $5 and $10 per child. Many of the families who sold their children were themselves products of previous generations of Grimwald experiments, creating a cycle of exploitation that had lasted nearly half a century. Constance, according to the files, had been trained from childhood to continue her father's work after his death in 1959. But where Dr. Grimwald had been motivated by scientific curiosity, his daughter seemed driven by something far darker, a belief that she was creating a new race of beings that would inherit the Earth after humanity destroyed itself. Kellerman's report to the Arkansas Department of Health triggered an immediate crisis at the highest levels of state government. Within hours of filing his preliminary findings, he was contacted by officials from the governor's office, the state police, and representatives from what appeared to be federal agencies whose identities were never clearly established. The response was swift and comprehensive. A team of what were described as medical specialists arrived in Blackwater Valley within 24 hours, accompanied by enough personnel to effectively quarantine the entire area. Local residents were told that a health emergency required temporary evacuation, and a perimeter was established around the Grimwald property that remained in place for 6 weeks. What happened during those 6 weeks was never officially documented, but fragments of information emerged over the years through leaked memos and the testimonies of personnel who later suffered what appeared to be nervous breakdowns. According to these accounts, the specialists found not just the 4 children in the cellar, but evidence of dozens of other subjects who had been disposed of over the decades. The property yielded a mass grave containing the remains of at least 30 children, many showing signs of surgical modification. The remains dated back to the 1920s, suggesting that Dr. Grimwald's experiments had claimed far more victims than even his meticulous records indicated. More disturbing were the discoveries in the main house. Hidden rooms contained what appeared to be breeding chambers, where modified children had been forced to reproduce in an attempt to create a second generation of mutations. The resulting offspring, according to the leaked reports, displayed genetic abnormalities so severe that most had not survived infancy. But perhaps most shocking of all was the discovery that the Grimwald experiments were not unique. Documents found in the house indicated correspondence with similar facilities in remote areas of Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky. The letters spoke of sharing specimens and comparing results, suggesting a network of underground medical experimentation that spanned multiple states. The official response to the Grimwald discovery was a masterpiece of bureaucratic suppression. Within 2 months, all physical evidence had been destroyed. The property had been purchased by a shell company and burned to the ground, and every person involved in the investigation had either been transferred to other departments or had suffered career-ending accidents. Kellerman himself was diagnosed with a stress-related psychological condition and forcibly retired on medical disability. His attempts to discuss the case publicly were met with threats of prosecution under various federal secrecy acts. He spent the remaining 15 years of his life as a broken man, telling his story only to his closest family members and a few journalists who were quickly discouraged from pursuing the matter. The children found in the cellar simply vanished. Official records claimed they had been relocated to specialized medical facilities, but no records of their treatment or whereabouts were ever produced. Freedom of Information Act requests filed decades later returned only heavily redacted documents that raised more questions than they answered. Local residents of Blackwater Valley were remarkably reluctant to discuss the events, even years later. Many claim no knowledge of the Grimwald family, despite census records showing they had been part of the community for generations. Those who would speak often referred to the family in past tense, as if they had never really existed at all. But the most chilling aspect of the cover-up was its effectiveness. Within 5 years, the official position was that the Grimwald case had been a misunderstanding. Rural poverty and medical neglect, misinterpreted by an inexperienced inspector who had suffered a mental breakdown. The medical evidence, the photographs, the documented experiments, all of it was dismissed as the fantasies of a disturbed mind. The Grimwald case might have remained buried forever, if not for a chance discovery in 2019. During renovations of the Arkansas State Health Department building in Little Rock, construction workers found a sealed room behind a false wall that had been forgotten for decades. Inside were file cabinets containing thousands of documents related to what was labeled Operation Blackwater, the official code name for the Grimwald investigation and cover-up. The documents, many still classified, painted a picture of government complicity that went far beyond simple bureaucratic incompetence. Internal memos revealed that federal agencies had been aware of Dr. Grimwald's experiments as early as 1943, but had allowed them to continue as part of a broader program investigating human biological modification for military applications. Even more disturbing was evidence that the Grimwald facility had not been unique. References in the document suggested similar operations in at least 12 other states, all operating under federal oversight and protection. The human experiments conducted in these facilities apparently continued well into the 1970s, with subjects ranging from volunteers from military and prison populations to children purchased from impoverished families. The discovery of these documents led to a brief flurry of investigative journalism, but the story was quickly overshadowed by other news cycles. Most media outlets that attempted to follow up on the story found their access to government sources mysteriously curtailed, and several journalists reported being approached by federal agents who strongly discouraged further investigation. However, some researchers have continued to pursue the truth behind Operation Blackwater and similar programs. Their work has revealed a pattern of human experimentation that appears to have been far more extensive and systematic than originally believed. Rural communities across the American South and Midwest show unusual rates of genetic abnormalities and birth defects that medical authorities continue to attribute to isolation and inbreeding, but which some researchers believe may be the legacy of decades of covert medical experimentation. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Grimwald case is the question of what happened to the children who survived the experiments. While official records claim they were transferred to medical facilities, no documentation of their treatment or eventual fate has ever been produced. However, scattered reports over the decades suggest that at least some of them may have survived. In 1987, a social worker in eastern Oklahoma reported encountering a family whose children displayed unusual physical characteristics: elongated limbs, extra joints, and a tendency to move in perfect synchronization. When she attempted to investigate further, she was told the family had moved away, and no records of their presence in the community could be found. Similar reports have emerged from rural areas across the Midwest, families with children whose physical development defies normal human patterns, communities where birth defects appear in clusters that suggest non-environmental or genetic factors. In each case, attempts to investigate are met with resistance from local authorities and the eventual disappearance of the subjects. More disturbing are reports from medical professionals who claim to have treated patients displaying characteristics consistent with surgical modification. A retired surgeon in Missouri, speaking anonymously, described treating a patient in the 1990s whose skeletal structure appeared to have been deliberately altered in childhood. The modifications were so extensive and precise that they could only have been performed by someone with advanced medical knowledge and access to sophisticated equipment. These scattered reports raise the possibility that the Grimwald experiments may have achieved their ultimate goal: the creation of a population of modified humans who have integrated into society while maintaining their altered characteristics. If true, it would mean that Dr. Grimwald's vision of a new race of beings may not have died with him, but instead has been quietly spreading through the American population for decades. The implications of such a possibility are staggering. If the experiments were successful in creating heritable genetic modifications, entire family lines may now carry traits that were artificially introduced through surgical intervention decades ago. The children and grandchildren of Dr. Grimwald's subjects may be walking among us, their unusual characteristics dismissed as normal human variation or attributed to other causes. Recent developments have added new layers to the Grimwald mystery. In 2021, genetic researchers studying unusual DNA patterns in rural American populations discovered sequences that appear to be artificially constructed. Genetic markers that could not have occurred naturally, but show signs of having been introduced into family bloodlines decades ago. The research, conducted by a team at the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences, was initially dismissed as contamination or experimental error, but similar patterns have now been found in samples from 12 different states, all in rural areas with histories of isolated communities and limited outside contact. Even more intriguing is the fact that these genetic markers appear to be functional. They code for proteins that enhance certain physical capabilities while suppressing others. Individuals carrying these markers show increased bone density, enhanced muscle fiber efficiency, and improved neural connectivity, but also display higher rates of organ dysfunction and shortened lifespans. The researchers have been careful to avoid connecting their findings to historical human experimentation programs, but the correlation is difficult to ignore. The geographic distribution of the genetic markers corresponds closely to areas where Operation Blackwater and similar programs were known to operate, and the timing of their introduction into the population matches the period when these experiments were most active. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the discovery that these genetic modifications appear to be self-reinforcing. Individuals carrying the artificial markers show a strong tendency to seek out partners with similar genetic profiles, suggesting an unconscious drive to maintain and strengthen the modifications across generations. This pattern raises the possibility that Dr. Grimwald's experiments were far more successful than anyone imagined, that they succeeded in creating not just individual modified humans, but an entire population with an instinctive drive to preserve and expand their artificial genetic heritage. In the deep woods of the Arkansas Ozarks, where the Grimwald homestead once stood, nothing remains but a clearing overgrown with briars and wild vine. The state bought the land decades ago and let it return to forest, hoping time would erase the memory of what happened there. But in the genetic code of families scattered across rural America, Dr. Mordecai Grimwald's legacy lives on, a testament to humanity's capacity for both scientific ambition and moral blindness. The children who survived his experiments have long since disappeared into the anonymity of American life, their modifications hidden beneath ordinary appearances, their artificial genetic heritage passed down to children and grandchildren who may never know the true source of their unusual traits. They are walking proof that the boundary between natural and artificial, between human and something else entirely, is far more fragile than we want to believe. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of the Grimwald case may not be what was done to those children in that underground laboratory, but what it reveals about the institutions we trust to protect us. When profit and scientific curiosity align with government secrecy and bureaucratic indifference, the distance between civilization and barbarity becomes nothing more than a locked door and a willingness to look the other way. And somewhere in America tonight, in small towns and rural communities where unusual children are born and unusual families keep to themselves, Dr. Grimwald's greatest experiment continues, not in the controlled environment of a laboratory, but in the vast genetic pool of a nation that has forgotten the price of its scientific progress.